January 11th, 1941, southwest Libya, 1,000 miles from the nearest British soldier. More than 2 dozen battered trucks roll out of the Sahara like a dust-covered mirage. They have been driving for 16 days. They have crossed the Great Sand Sea, a rolling ocean of dunes as wide as England, without a road, without a useful map, and without being seen by a single Italian scout plane. The temperature on the truck hoods hits 130 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. At night, it drops below freezing. Now, at midday, they slow their approach to the outskirts of the Italian garrison town of Murzuk. The fort at the far end of town is flying the Italian flag. The guards in the watchtower are looking outward toward the absolute nothingness beyond the walls. The one direction in 3 years of occupying this outpost from which no threat has ever come. The lead truck passes a lone cyclist on the road into town. An Italian in a postal uniform. He is the postmaster of Murzuk, on his way to deliver the mail to the garrison. He looks up. He sees the convoy. He sees the machine guns bolted to the truck beds. He sees the faces underneath the sun-bleached head wraps. They are not Italian. He opens his mouth to say something, and one of the men simply lifts him, bicycle and all, into the back of a truck. They will sort him out later. The convoy splits. One group peels toward the airfield. The other accelerates toward the fort gates. In minutes, there will be 3 Italian aircraft on fire, a fuel dump going up in a black column that can be seen for miles, a garrison scrambling in disbelief, and a French officer cauterizing his own leg wound with a lit cigarette. That is the story you think you know. But here is the question that almost no one asks. How? How do 76 men in about 2 dozen trucks carrying 3 weeks of food, water, ammunition, and fuel cross 1,400 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth without being spotted, without breaking down beyond recovery, without losing a single man to thirst in a place that can kill an unprotected human being in a matter of hours? The answer is not the trucks. Every army in Africa had trucks. The answer is one man, a quiet, meticulous British Royal Engineers officer who spent 10 years of his own time, his own money, and his own leave driving into the interior of the Libyan desert. Not for strategy, not for military purpose, but because he was curious about how sand dunes work. His name was Ralph Bagnold, and what he did in that desert in the 1920s and 30s out of pure scientific curiosity would eventually become the most cost-effective military secret weapon of the entire North African War. Rommel himself would concede, after roughly 2 years of fighting them, that Bagnold's creation caused his forces more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. At its peak, that unit numbered 350 men. To understand how a middle-aged engineer with a homemade compass built the unit that quietly bled the Afrika Korps, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to the war, to the sand. The year is 1925. A 29-year-old British officer named Ralph Bagnold has just been posted to Egypt as a signals officer. While his fellow officers spend their evenings at Cairo's Gezira Sporting Club or in the bars of Alexandria, Bagnold does something different. He buys a Model T Ford and he drives it into the desert. Not on roads. Roads end quickly in Egypt. He drives beyond the roads into the sand. He gets stuck. He digs himself out. He tries again. He gets stuck again. He studies exactly why he got stuck. And then methodically, like the engineer he is, he figures out how not to get stuck the next time. Ralph Alger Bagnold, born in Devonport in 1896. Son of a Royal Engineers colonel. Cambridge engineering degree. He had served in the trenches of the First World War as a teenager and emerged with the kind of patience that trench warfare imparts. The willingness to observe a problem for a very long time before acting on it. His younger sister Enid would grow up to write the novel National Velvet. Ralph would grow up to understand sand. And here is the first thing you need to hold in your mind about this man. Everything he was about to discover, everything that would later matter to Wavell. To Montgomery, to the outcome of the North African campaign he discovered on his own time. On his own weekends for no reason at all. There was no military mission. There was no order. There was no budget. There was only a curious man and a very large desert. Everyone assumed the interior of Libya, an expanse the size of India, was impassable. The Egyptian prince Kamal el-Dine had crossed part of the Great Sand Sea with caterpillar trucks and camel trains and declared the rest beyond reach. Every serious explorer of the era agreed. The dunes rose too high, the loose sand was too deep. Bagnall did not accept this verdict. He just started testing things. He discovered first that if you reduce tire pressure radically far below what feels safe, a standard civilian tire will spread its footprint across the sand and float rather than sink. The trick was counterintuitive. Less pressure felt dangerous, but it worked. A deflated tire did not dig in, it rode. He worked out the exact pressure tables for different terrain. Deep loose dunes, hard rippled sand, mixed gravel and silt. This sounds like a small detail. It was not. It was the foundational discovery that made desert driving possible without caterpillar tracks. And he figured it out alone on his weekends. Then there was the radiator problem. An internal combustion engine in desert heat is not a happy machine. It runs constantly at the edge of boiling. When it boils over, it loses water from the radiator as steam. Water that in the interior of Libya, where there is no water source for 500 miles, is irreplaceable. You could carry fuel, you could carry food, you could not carry enough water if your engine kept drinking it. Bagnall's solution was elegant and almost embarrassingly simple. He blocked the standard radiator overflow pipe and replaced it with a hose that ran into a 2-gallon metal can bolted to the front fender. The can was kept half full of cold water. When the engine overheated and produced steam, the steam ran into the can and condensed back into water. When the engine cooled after being switched off, the resulting suction pulled all of that condensed water automatically back into the radiator. Not a single drop wasted. The system weighed almost nothing. It required no electricity, no moving parts. Field engineers years later would describe it as beautiful in its simplicity. Now think about what that meant operationally. A standard military vehicle in desert conditions lost water constantly and demanded resupply every few days. Bagnall's modified vehicle carried its own water forward indefinitely. A 1,000-mile patrol suddenly became conceivable. The third discovery was navigation. The Libyan desert has a specific problem that kills compasses. Massive iron ore deposits scattered through the sand and rock. A magnetic compass near these deposits can read 30 or 40 degrees of true bearing. An error that would send a patrol miles in the wrong direction over the course of a single day. The British Army in 1940 had no working solution for this. Their magnetic compasses designed for European terrain and tracked vehicles were essentially useless across vast stretches of the Sahara. Bagnall built a different kind of compass. He called it the sun compass. His design was a rotating disc graduated in 360 degrees with a vertical pin in the center that cast a shadow. The disc was set according to tables that gave the sun's precise azimuth at any latitude on any day at any 10-minute interval. By rotating the disc to match the sun's current position and reading the shadow, a driver could establish and maintain an accurate bearing continuously, regardless of iron ore, regardless of the metal in his own vehicle. At each night's halt, a theodolite, a precision surveying instrument, was used to shoot the stars and fix an exact position, correcting any accumulated error. In the morning, the patrol knew exactly where it was on a continent that was largely unmapped. Bagnall tested and refined these techniques across a decade of private expeditions. In 1929, using a Ford Model A and 2 lorries loaded with 150 gallons of fuel, he crossed the Great Sand Sea for the first time. The dunes that Prince Kamal el-Dine had called utterly impassable. He found a route through. He charted it. In 1932, in 3 Model A Fords, with a party of 6 men, he staged the first recorded east-to-west crossing of the entire Libyan desert. 1,100 miles from the Nile Valley to the Libyan interior across terrain that had not been traversed by human beings since the prehistoric era. He filled in blank spaces on maps that had been blank since the ancient Egyptians drew them. He wrote it all up in a book published in 1935, Libyan Sands, Travel in a Dead World. It was read by adventure enthusiasts and geographers. Almost no one in the British military paid it any attention. That same year, 1935, Bagnold left the army. He had given them something extraordinary, and they had not noticed. He went to Cambridge to write a scientific treatise on the physics of wind-blown sand, a work so precise that decades later NASA would use it to model the terrain of Mars and eventually name a formation of Martian dunes after him. He was not bitter about the army's indifference. He was just interested in sand. What nobody knew in 1935, what no one could have predicted, was that 6 years later, one of the most crucial theaters of the Second World War would take place in exactly the terrain he had spent a decade mapping, and that the techniques he had worked out alone with Model T Fords and a homemade compass would be the only thing standing between the British Empire in the Middle East and catastrophic defeat. But first, there had to be a collision at sea. On the 10th of June 1940, Italy declared war on Britain. Ralph Bagnold, now 44 years old, had rejoined the army at the outbreak of the war. Of course he had, but nobody in the War Office quite knew what to do with a Royal Engineers Major who specialized in desert sand physics. So they were sending him somewhere. Anywhere. In this case, a posting in East Africa. He was on a troop ship in the Mediterranean when another ship struck his. The damage forced an emergency diversion to an Egyptian port for repairs. Bagnold disembarked. He was standing on a quay in Egypt when the radio announced that Italy had declared war on Britain and that North Africa, Libya, Egypt, the Libyan desert was now a theater of war. He looked at a map of North Africa, and he saw something no one in the British High Command had noticed. The Italian military, like everyone else, had built their entire strategic position around the narrow coastal strip. One road, the Via Balbia, running along the Mediterranean coast from Tripoli to Benghazi. Their forts, their supply lines, their plans for offense and defense, all pivoted on this single road. They had looked at the interior desert and concluded, as every authority had concluded, that it was militarily useless. Impassable. A barrier rather than a route. Bagnold knew it wasn't. He immediately requested an interview with General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East. This is the kind of request that normally dies on a staff officer's desk. A newly disembarked engineer major asking for a personal audience with a theater commander to discuss of all things driving trucks in the desert. Wavell, to his considerable credit, agreed to the meeting. He himself had served in the region during the First World War. He had some understanding of desert warfare's peculiarities. And he was at that precise moment a man with 250,000 Italians on his western border and not nearly enough soldiers of his own to stop them. The meeting took place on the 23rd of June, 1940. 13 days after Italy entered the war. Bagnold walked in and explained his concept. A small force, very small, of highly trained, specially equipped men in modified civilian trucks. Not armor, not tanks. Civilian trucks modified using the techniques he had spent a decade perfecting. They would operate deep behind Italian lines in the interior desert, the zone the Italian General Staff had dismissed as a non-factor. They would gather intelligence. They would harass and raid Italian positions from directions no Italian commander would think to defend, because no Italian commander believed a military force could get there. Wavell listened. Then he asked one question. What if you get all the way behind enemy lines and find nothing worth doing? Bagnold answered without hesitation. In that case, sir, we would engage in acts of piracy. Wavell smiled. He approved the project on the spot. And then he added the condition that should stop you cold. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to build a unit from nothing. Not 6 months, not a year. 6 weeks. In a summer when Britain itself was preparing for invasion. When every rifle, every truck, every trained man was already promised to someone. Bagnold had no men, no vehicles, no equipment, no maps of the Libyan interior that the British Army recognized as accurate. No budget. He did not argue. He went to work. He ignored normal procurement channels entirely. He walked down the streets of Cairo into the yards of the commercial truck dealers. The same yards where Egyptian merchants bought vehicles for hauling produce and cotton and fuel. He tested what they had, and he settled on a specific machine. The Chevrolet 3000 weight commercial truck, two-wheel drive, a civilian workhorse available off any lot used up and down the Nile Valley to carry goods to market. The Cairo dealers could supply about 14 of them. Bagnold persuaded the Egyptian army, which was not yet at war, to part with roughly 19 more. Around 33 commercial trucks in total. The same trucks that grocers used to deliver bread and vegetables. He took them to the British ordnance workshops. The men there dropped everything else and began modifying them from specifications Bagnold wrote on the spot from a decade of failure in the sand. Doors off, windscreens off, roofs off, every ounce of unnecessary metal removed. In a truck that has to cross soft sand dunes, every pound matters. The front grille panels were cut away to improve airflow to the engine in 130-degree heat. Larger radiators were installed along with Bagnold's condensing system. That humble 2-gallon can bolted to the fender that would recycle every drop of steam back into the cooling water. Special air filters were fitted to prevent sand from destroying the engines. Low-pressure balloon tires replaced the standard issue. Leaf springs were reinforced to carry loads far beyond the truck's original design. Each vehicle received 6 to 8 welded mounting points for machine guns, so a weapon could be repositioned wherever it was needed. Grocers' trucks in a matter of weeks became something else entirely. While the trucks were being rebuilt, Bagnold was rebuilding his old life. He needed men who knew the desert, real desert, not the tourist edges of it. He found Rupert Harding Newman locally serving as a liaison officer with the Egyptian army. William Kennedy Shaw, the archaeologist who worked at the Palestine Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, was pulled out of the museum and into uniform within days. Patrick Clayton, one of the finest surveyors of the Egyptian Desert Survey, was on a surveying job in the wilds of Tanganyika. The Tanganyika government found him, put him on a special aircraft, and flew him to Cairo. Both men, Shaw and Clayton, were in Cairo in uniform commissioned as army captains within 3 days of Bagnold asking for them. He needed navigators, real navigators, men who could read the position of a star through a theodolite, in the middle of the night in the middle of the Sahara, exhausted and cold after driving all day, and produce a location accurate to a few hundred yards. In the entire British Middle East Command, there was exactly one theodolite available. Bagnold borrowed a second from his old friend George Murray at the Egyptian Desert Survey. A third was located in Nairobi, Kenya, and flown to Cairo specifically for this purpose. 3 theodolites, to measure the position on a good night of the stars over an empire that was about to depend on them. He needed soldiers. Not just soldiers. He needed a very particular kind of man. He wanted men who had grown up working with their hands fixing machines, making do without spare parts. Men who could sit in silence for hours without going mad. Men who could tolerate genuine hardship without complaining, because complaining in a small patrol far from help could break the group. He asked to speak to the 2nd New Zealand Division. The advertisement he had them post is one of the most honest recruiting pitches ever written. Only men who do not mind a hard life, with scanty food, little water, and lots of discomfort. Men who possess stamina and initiative need apply. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of men stepped forward. Bagnold selected 2 officers and about 85 men, mostly from the Divisional Cavalry and the 27th Machine Gun Battalion. Farm boys from the North Island and the South Island. Men who had spent their childhood keeping a broken tractor running through a lambing season. Men who understood at a level deeper than any manual what it means to be a long way from a spare part. 6 weeks after Wavell's authorization, the unit was ready. They called it the Long Range Patrol. In November, once the volunteers from Britain and Southern Rhodesia had joined, the name changed. Long Range Desert Group, LRD-G, rebuilt commercial trucks. A sun compass, a radiator can, a theodolite, and a scientist who understood sand better than any general in either army. The first patrol went out in August. 2 units, one led by Bagnold himself, simply drove out of Cairo and disappeared into the desert. They were gone for weeks. When they came back, they had crossed 4,000 miles of terrain. that both the Italian and German high commands had declared impassable. They had scouted Italian outposts. They had observed daily routines from concealed positions. They had gathered intelligence that British aerial reconnaissance could not obtain. They had not been detected, not once. The few British officers who had privately dismissed the LRDG as the pet project of a desert eccentric went very quiet. Wavell's response was one sentence: double the size of the unit, and stir up trouble wherever you find it. The men who came back from those first patrols were changed. There is a phrase that recurs in accounts from this period. A description of what LRDG men looked like when they returned to Cairo. Unwashed because the water ration did not permit bathing. Bearded, burned almost black by the sun, dressed in ragged shirts and shorts and Bedouin sandals. One officer compared them to a group of wild-eyed biblical hermits emerging from their long sojourn in the wilderness. They had gone into the desert, and now they were of the desert. A standard LRDG patrol was 40 men and 10 trucks. It lasted 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, it covered 2,000 miles, not road miles, desert miles, through dune fields, gravel plains, rock ridges, and dried lake beds. Some patrols would cover 3,000 or 4,000 miles without returning to base. The water ration was 1 gallon per man per day. That included cooking, that included drinking, that included whatever the radiator might demand in an emergency, in temperatures that routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, for 3 weeks at a stretch. Hold that in your mind for a moment. 1 gallon of water, 120 degrees, 21 days. The condensing can on the fender refined from the design Bagnold had worked out on his own expeditions in the 1930s was not a convenience. It was the margin between survival and death. If that condenser failed, and a truck started losing radiator water at the standard rate, the patrol commander faced a calculation with no good answer. Abandon the truck and redistribute its cargo, or send another truck back to base for water on fuel that might not be there for the return journey. Bagnold's little can did not just save water, it saved the operational integrity of the entire unit. The mechanics, most of them New Zealand farm boys, became artists of field repair. One patrol later towed a truck with a broken rear axle 900 miles through the desert before they found the parts to fix it. They did not abandon it. They towed it 900 miles. Because the cargo it carried fuel, water, ammunition was irreplaceable. But raiding was not the main mission. Not really. The main mission was to watch. The Italians, and later the Germans under Rommel, had one supply line for their entire North African campaign. 1. The Via Balbia, 500 miles of metal-led road along the Mediterranean coast. Everything that moved between Rommel's front lines and his supply ports moved down that one road. Tanks, fuel, food, ammunition, replacement personnel, artillery, medicine. There was no parallel route. The desert to the south, as far as any Axis planner was concerned, did not exist militarily. The LRDG drove through it, and within sight of the Via Balbia, they dug shallow scrapes in the ground, and they hid men in them, for weeks at a time. The road watch. From March 1942, in 2-hour shifts, day and night, LRDG men lay motionless in those scrapes, a few hundred yards from the main Axis supply route. Watching, counting, every vehicle that passed, type, direction, speed, time, frequency, unit markings. One man from a road watch later tried to describe what it was like. He said, you look at your watch at 11 o'clock. 4 hours later it is 11:15. 4 hours to move 15 minutes. But the reports they radioed back, tonnage of fuel, numbers of tanks, frequency of ammunition convoys would be assessed by the head of British Middle East military intelligence as the single most important contribution the LRDG made to the entire campaign. Before the Second Battle of El Alamein, the battle that broke the back of Rommel's army, Montgomery's planners knew the precise rhythm of Axis resupply. They knew what Rommel was getting. They knew what he wasn't. Because of 40 men in scrapes in the sand, in heat that made the metal on their trucks too hot to touch. That was the patient side of Bagnall's genius. The scientific side, applied to war. The other side was demonstrated most vividly 1 week in January 1941 when the LRDGI was ordered to stop watching and start hitting. The target was Murzuk, capital of the Italian-held Fezzan region of southwestern Libya. As the crow flies 1100 miles from Cairo, over the actual ground following the routes Bagnall had charted with Model A Fords in the 1930s closer to 1400 miles. A round trip approaching 3000 miles of desert driving, in commercial trucks, in January. For context, 1400 miles from London reaches beyond Moscow. Even Bagnall's condensing radiators and low-pressure tires could not stretch a patrol that far without help. He arranged a logistical partnership with the Free French forces in Chad, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Gian Colonna d'Ornano. The French would preposition fuel dumps in the Tibesti Mountains for the LRDG to pick up on the way in. D'Ornano's price for that cooperation was simple. He was coming on the raid, he and 10 of his men. 2 officers from 2 different empires sitting across a table in Chad, agreeing that they would drive together into a fort neither of them had ever seen. Only one of them would be coming back. The convoy left Cairo on the 26th of December 1940. 76 men, around 25 or 26 vehicles depending on which account you read. Under the command of Captain Patrick Clayton, one of Bagnall's oldest desert friends. New Year's Eve came and went in the sand, somewhere in the middle of the Sahara. Nobody counted down. Nobody drank. There was no water to spare. They crossed sand seas. They navigated by Bagnall's sun compass, in the day by the stars at night. They found the French fuel dumps in the Tibesti Mountains, exactly where D'Ornano had promised. They refueled. They kept going. On the 11th of January 1941, they stopped for lunch a few miles short of Murzuk, and Clayton laid out the final plan on the hood of his truck. You already know what happened next. The postmaster on his bicycle, the garrison whose lookouts were staring outward at the wrong horizon, the 2-pronged assault on fort and airfield launched almost simultaneously, the 3 Italian Caproni Ghibli aircraft on the runway, the fuel dump going up in a black column that would be visible for miles. What the summary at the top of this video did not tell you was the price. D'Ornano was killed at the fort, shot in the throat. He died within minutes, the first Free French officer to fall in the Desert War. He had been in the LRDG for barely 2 weeks. A second man, Sergeant C.D. Hewson of New Zealand, was also killed in the attack. 2 more men were wounded. One Frenchman, shot through the leg, refused to stop firing and cauterized his own wound by pressing the burning end of a cigarette into the entry hole so he could keep his hands on his weapon. By the time the Italians in Tripoli understood what had happened and got aircraft into the air, the convoy was already dispersing back into a desert that did not officially exist. But the Italians had learned something. 3 weeks later, on the 31st of January 1941, an Italian reconnaissance plane spotted T Patrol. Around 30 men in 11 trucks near a small rocky valley called Gebel Sherif, south of the Kufra oasis. The plane circled. It radioed positions, and it directed an Italian motorized patrol, the Auto Sahariana, armed with vehicles mounting 20mm cannons. This was not a skirmish. A 20mm cannon is a different category of weapon from an LRDG Lewis gun. T Patrol's trucks had no armor. When the Italian vehicles opened up at range, the result was catastrophic. 4 trucks were destroyed. Several men were killed or wounded. Clayton, himself already hit, was forced to surrender with a portion of his patrol. It was the first real defeat the LRDG had suffered. And what happened next is the part of this story that history books almost never tell. A 22-year-old New Zealand farm boy named Ronald Moore, a trooper, no rank at all, really watched his officers get killed or captured. He watched the trucks burn. He looked at the survivors around him, and he looked at the empty horizon. And he began to walk. He led the men who were still on their feet on foot through the Libyan desert toward the nearest point of safety. 210 miles away, He would receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal for what he did over the days that followed. His name appears in almost no popular history of the Desert War. And meanwhile, back in Berlin, someone was studying the LRDG's raids very carefully. Someone had noticed that a small British unit was operating from directions that Rommel's defensive plans did not cover, and that someone had a suggestion. They knew a man, a Hungarian count, a pre-war desert explorer, a man who had once upon a time moved through the same corner of Libya as a very quiet British officer named Ralph Bagnold. His name was Laszlo Almasi, and the German High Command was about to offer him a job. Laszlo Almasi, Hungarian aristocrat, aviator, desert explorer. In the 1930s, both men had explored the same corner of the Libyan sand. They had met in the small community of European desert explorers. They had shared knowledge of routes across the same dune fields and looked up at the same stars. By 1942, Almasi was wearing a German uniform, attached to Rommel's staff as an expert on desert navigation. His job was to help the Africa Corps do what the LRDG was already doing. Move through terrain the other side thought was empty. He would even lead a German operation codenamed Salam, deep into Egyptian territory using pre-war routes he had helped chart. The compliment could not have been more direct. The Germans had studied the LRDG, and they had decided the only man who might be able to copy them was the one man in Europe who had helped invent their methods in the first place. But copying the LRDG was harder than Berlin realized, because what they were trying to copy was not a truck, it was not a weapon, it was 10 years of accumulated knowledge about how the desert actually worked, knowledge that lived quietly in the minds of Bagnold's men, in the exact pressure of a low-slung tire, in the exact tilt of a sun compass at noon, in the exact position of a boot on a running board when a truck starts to slide sideways on a dune. You cannot buy that. You cannot manufacture it in a factory. You can only earn it, in the sand, over 10 years, when nobody is watching and nobody is paying, and nobody yet knows that any of it will ever matter. By the second half of 1942, the LRDG had been operating for 2 years, and their work was about to enter its most decisive phase. The 13th of September 1942. Operation Caravan. The target was the town of Barts on the coastal plateau of Cyrenaica and the Italian airfield attached to it. The airfield hosted Italian aircraft that had been harassing Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. Someone in Cairo had decided that it should no longer exist. The force assigned to the destruction was 2 LRDG patrols, 47 men, 17 trucks and jeeps. The distance to the target from their base at Kufra was over 1100 miles. One way. They drove for 2 weeks. They approached the plateau at night. They descended a mountain track that Italian defensive planners had left uncovered because no one in the Italian command believed a mechanized force could descend it. They were wrong about that. Again. The attack began just after midnight. LRDG trucks drove directly onto the Italian airfield. Machine guns swept the aircraft dispersal areas. Men on foot ran between fuselages, planting incendiary bombs beneath wings and cockpits. Fuel dumps detonated. Hangars caught fire. In under an hour they destroyed or seriously damaged somewhere between 20 and 30 Italian aircraft. Different accounts give different figures. All of them are catastrophic for a single night's work by 47 men. But this time the withdrawal was expensive. Italian and German forces responded faster than the LRDG had anticipated. In the pursuit that followed, the raiders were harried by aircraft and armored cars for 2 days. Trucks were lost. Men were wounded. By the time the survivors reached safety, 12 LRDG men had been killed, wounded, or captured. It was the highest single operation casualty toll the unit had ever suffered. Measured against the damage inflicted 12 men for 20-plus aircraft, it was still a lopsided victory. But the men who came out of Bars and the men who did not would carry the memory of that prize for the rest of their lives. And then, in early 1943, came the operation that almost no one has ever heard of, which was arguably the most important thing the LRDG did in the entire Desert War. It did not involve a single shot fired. The Axis forces in Libya had been broken by the Second Battle of El Alamein 3 months earlier. They were retreating westward toward Tunisia. Montgomery's Eighth Army was pursuing them. At the Tunisian border, the retreating Axis had prepared a defensive position along the Mareth line, a belt of old French fortifications that Montgomery could not simply drive through. He needed to go around. But around meant the desert, and even the best British maps of southern Tunisia were incomplete. The passes through the hills between the desert and the coastal plain were poorly charted. A wrong route meant a column of tanks and trucks bogged down in ground. They could not exit miles from where they were needed with the battle already decided against them. An LRDG patrol went in first. They found a pass. An unmapped route through the hills of southern Tunisia. Wide enough, firm enough, passable by a full mechanized division. They surveyed it. They marked it. They reported it back to 8th Army headquarters. Montgomery sent the New Zealand division through the gap. The New Zealanders came out on the flank and rear of the Mareth line behind the Axis position in ground where nobody had expected to see them. The Axis defenses were rolled up. The North African campaign was effectively decided. The pass was entered into British maps. It was given a name, Wilder's Gap, after Captain Nick Wilder, a New Zealander in his late 20s, an LRDG officer who had gone in first and found it. His full name, his age, his unit appear in almost no popular account of El Alamein or the Mareth line battles. The history books remember Montgomery's flanking maneuver. They do not always remember the man in the truck who went in ahead of him to find the flank. By the end of the North African campaign, the arithmetic of what the LRDG had accomplished was almost impossible to believe. 350 men at their peak, 200 trucks, 16 killed and 24 missing or captured across the entire Mediterranean campaign from 1940 to the end of the North African fighting in 1943. 40 men over 3 years. In operations that routinely put patrols 300 miles inside enemy-controlled territory for 3 weeks at a time. Over 200 missions completed. In the entire 5-year existence of the LRDG there were only about 5 months in total when no patrol was operating behind enemy lines. According to captured German intelligence documents, the LRDG was described as playing an extremely important part in enemy sabotage operations. It was the kind of professional respect the Wehrmacht did not hand out easily. And Rommel himself, looking back on his war in the sand, conceded that this unit had caused his forces more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. Any. But here is the part of this story that is genuinely hard to accept. The man who designed the sun compass, who invented the radiator condenser, who mapped the routes, who selected the men, who built the unit from 33 commercial trucks in 6 weeks, who commanded its first operations. Ralph Bagnold was quietly promoted away from the LRDG on the 1st of July 1941. He was made a full colonel. He was given a staff position in Cairo. In the polite language of the military, he was moved upstairs. Kicked upstairs, some would say. At the precise moment his creation was beginning to prove its worth, most dramatically, its creator was taken out of operational command and put behind a desk. The unit passed to Guy Prendergast, then to Jake Eason-Smith, who would die on Leros in November 1943, then to David Lloyd Owen. They were fine officers. They extended and refined what Bagnold had built, but the fame that eventually attached to Desert Special Operations attached to other names. David Sterling of the SAS, Bernard Montgomery, Erwin Rommel himself. Not to a Royal Engineers colonel who had spent the 1930s in the Libyan sand for no reason at all. Bagnold lived to be 94. He died in England on the 28th of May 1990. He never wrote a memoir for the general public. He continued his scientific work on wind-blown sand into his 90s. The Geological Society of London gave him the Wollaston Medal. The American National Academy of Sciences gave him the G.K. Warren Prize. He published academic papers when most men his age were long finished with everything. And decades after his death, on a small rover crawling across the surface of Mars, NASA's Curiosity mission drove up to a formation of dark rippled sand dunes inside Gale Crater. The scientists on the mission needed a name for them. They chose one. the Bagnold Dunes. The man who had understood sand well enough to build a military unit around that, understanding now has sand dunes on another planet named after him. He does not have a major public monument in Britain. He is not a household name. He was, in his own words, a man who studied how the desert works. And here is what we can say with real certainty, looking back across more than 80 years at the record of the North African campaign. The British had an army. Rommel had an army. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, supply lines that stretched back to shipping lanes that stretched back to factories in Europe. For much of the war in the sand, those armies ground each other to a standstill in a back and forth that consumed men and metal at a rate neither side could sustain. Into that stalemate, one man introduced a different kind of weapon. Not a better tank, not a longer range gun, a way of seeing, a way of moving through the terrain that everyone else had declared unusable. Knowledge. The knowledge of how to deflate a tire in soft sand, how to recycle the steam from a boiling radiator through a 2-gallon can bolted to a fender, how to fix a position by shooting stars through a theodolite at midnight, how to hide 10 trucks in a dry riverbed. The enemy does not know exists, while 20 miles away, 4 men lie motionless in a scrape in the sand, counting vehicles on a road above them. That knowledge applied by 350 men in grocers' trucks with the doors taken off quietly tipped the balance of a campaign that helped shape the outcome of the war. When Allied victory in North Africa opened the way to Sicily, then Italy, then the Second Front, then the end of the Reich, the chain of cause and effect runs backward link by link. To Wilder's Gap, to the Road Watch, to Murzuk, to the postmaster on his bicycle, to the 2-gallon can on the fender. And back further to a 29-year-old British officer in 1925 who bought a Model T Ford and drove it on his weekends into the sand because he wanted to see what would happen. The verdict is in. The most lethal desert weapon of the North African campaign was not made of armor plate and high explosive. It was made of scientific curiosity, quiet stubbornness, and about 33 Chevrolet trucks bought from a Cairo car dealer. And the men who drove those trucks, the New Zealand farm boys, the British guardsmen, the Rhodesian volunteers, the Free French soldiers, who came along for one raid and never came home, deserve to be remembered by name, not just as the LRDG, as individuals. As Trooper Ronald Moore, who walked 210 miles through the Libyan desert rather than give up. As Captain Patrick Clayton, who mapped half the Libyan interior before the war and finished the war in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, visited there, according to some accounts by the very friend from his pre-war expeditions, who had now signed on with the other side. As Lieutenant Colonel Gian Colonna Dornano of the Free French, who did not have to come on the raid to Murzuk, and came anyway and did not come home. As Captain Nick Wilder, whose name, if you go looking for it, appears on a gap in a Tunisian hillside and almost nowhere else. And as Colonel Ralph Alger Bagnold, who wrote near the end of his life about the pre-war expeditions that gave him the knowledge to build the LRDG. He wrote that never in their peacetime travels had they imagined that war could ever reach the enormous empty solitudes of the inner desert. Little did they dream, he said, that any of the special equipment and techniques they had evolved for long-distance travel for navigation would ever be put to serious use. The desert that no one imagined could be reached was the desert that decided everything, and a quiet man who was simply curious about sand made it happen.